This is the Chassidic Story Project with Barak Hullman, podcasting from Jerusalem, Israel. This podcast is sponsored by listeners just like you. To become a supporter of this podcast, please go to HassidicStory.com, HASIDIC story.com. You'll never know, you'll never know, you'll never know, you'll never know. One of the Chassidim of the Baal Shem Tov was a very simple and successful lumberjack. He was a simple Jew who just knew Tehillim and how to pray a little bit, and spent most of his days out in the forest chopping wood. When his son came of marriageable age, there were several proposals given to him, but every time that he would meet a future Kala, he would faint on the spot. His father brought him to all the best doctors, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with this boy, because he didn't faint any other time, only when he would meet these women that were potentially his wives. No one could figure out what the problem was. So eventually the Chassid said, okay, we have to go to the Baal Shem Tov and ask his advice. The Baal Shem Tov told the Chassid, don't worry, when he meets his Kala, he won't faint. Now the Chassid made his living by chopping down trees in the forest. He would cut them into lumber and then throw them into the nearby river. The strong flow of the stream would take the logs down the river, where they would be processed in a factory and then sold by his agent. And only when the lumber had been sold in the city would the lumberjack be paid for his work. One winter, the lumberjack had a very successful season. He kept cutting more and more wood and throwing it onto the icy river. He kept imagining the huge amount of money that he was going to make. But as the snow started to melt, the waters in the river overflowed, and all of the wood that he had cut all winter long was lost. Not only did he lose his dreams of prosperity, he lost his entire livelihood. And until he delivered another load to the city, he didn't have any money at all. He didn't even know how he was going to support his family. So, again, the Chassid went to the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov looked at the Chassid for a long time and he said, I'm very sorry, but I can't help you. You're going to have to become a beggar. And the Chassid, his eyes filled with tears because he was ashamed to think of being a beggar. Here he'd always been such a wealthy man and was always able to give and never need to take. He said, Rebbe, please, is there something else I can do? But the Baal Shem Tov only shook his head, and then the Chassid realized, okay, I better start begging. So he started to travel all around Poland, begging in all the towns and village, and he felt so broken. He only had one comfort. Whenever he had some time, in the middle of the day, at the end of the day, he'd stop in the local Beit Midrash and learn some Torah. And one day he came to a large town that was quite far from his home. He made his rounds begging for money, and then, as was his custom, he went into the Beit Midrash and started learning Torah. There was a wealthy Jew who lived in town who had seen the Chassid come by his house earlier that day, and he saw him sitting there learning Torah. This wealthy Jew goes over to the Chassid and says, you know, I've been watching you, and when I saw you before, I thought there was something different about you. You weren't like the other schleppers. And now that I see you learning Torah like this, for sure, there's no question that there's something special about you. Tell me, how much money do you earn when you go begging all day long? And the Chassid, he closed his eyes and gave a sigh. Not so much, I'm sorry to say. Maybe a ruble and a half. The wealthy Jew says to the lumberjack, listen, I have an offer for you. I'm very wealthy, and I have a thriving business. But my business affairs take up all my time, and I don't have any time to learn Torah. And you know, a house without Torah is an empty house. So why don't I make a deal with you? I'll pay you 2.5 rubles a day, and all you have to do is sit and learn in my house. And whenever you want, you can take your pay and go back to your family. Of course, the Chassid agrees immediately. And for several weeks, the former lumberjack is sitting in the wealthy man's house, learning Torah all day into the night. And he got to know the whole family, especially the daughter of the wealthy man, who reminded him of his own children. And then late one night, he heard the wealthy man and his wife talking. The woman was crying. And at breakfast the next morning, the lumberjack, he said, I'm really sorry if I'm intruding on your private affairs, but I couldn't help overhearing you having a conversation last night, and you were very upset. And you've been so kind to me. I was just wondering, is there anything I can do to help you? The businessman and his wife, they hesitated for a minute, and then they told the lumberjack that their daughter had reached the age to get married, and she had all these shidduchim, but every time she was introduced, she fainted on the spot. And they've taken her to all the doctors, and nobody can seem to figure out what the problem is. So the Chassid smiled sadly to himself, and he said, I completely understand what's going on. He's thinking about his son, of course. He said, you know, I'm a follower of the Heilige Baal Shem Tov, and just the other day I was thinking, it's time for me to go home and go see the Rebbe. So why don't you take your daughter and come with me to the Rebbe? Maybe the Rebbe can help her. So the Chassid and the businessman and his family, they all set out the next day for the Baal Shem Tov, and 2 weeks later, they were standing in his room. As soon as the Baal Shem Tov saw them, he said, I'll be happy to talk with you, but first, he says, turning to the Chassid, go get your wife and son and tell them to wait in the next room, and then come back here and we'll discuss everything. The Chassid couldn't understand why the Baal Shem Tov wanted this, but of course, he did as he was told. He brought his wife and son, and they came back to the Heilige Baal Shem Tov's holy private room, where the businessman and his family were waiting. The Baal Shem Tov listened quietly as the wealthy man explained their problem, and then he asked, tell me, can you give your daughter a good dowry? Oh yes, the businessman said. You know, until recently I barely made enough money to support my family. And then the most unbelievable miracle happened. One morning, it was a terrible winter storm, and I woke up in the morning and our front yard was covered with lumber. We had no idea where the wood came from and no way to return it to the original owner. So after consulting with a Rav, we sold it to a lumber yard. And I made so much money that I was able to open a business, which has, Baruch Hashem, been even more successful. So yeah, it's not a problem for us at all to provide for your daughter. The Heilige Baal Shem Tov, he just smiled. And then he said to the Chassid, Nu, go bring in your wife and son. And when they came into the room, the Chassid's son looked at the businessman's daughter, and the rich man's daughter looked at the former lumberjack's son, and neither of them fainted. How great are the ways of Hashem, the Baal Shem Tov said. He turned to the Chassid, and you see, Hashem brought it about so that you should lose all of your money and all of your lumber, so that this man would be the one that finds it and become rich, and then invite you into his house. And all of that was only to bring your son and your daughter together in order so that they should find each other. And not just that, to be able to make both the families wealthy. So now the Baal Shem Tov turned to the wealthy Jew and he said, since that lumber actually belonged to this Chassid over here, you should really pay him back what he lent you. And the wealthy man gave him half of his fortune, and the two families were able to continue lives of tzedakah and Torah and help the new couple in their new life together.
Mama,